Salam and peace. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching us on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and YouTube, and many places, along with MuslimNetwork.tv, our own website. Pretty soon we'll be on Apple TV as well. Well, just a couple of days before the Independence Day, and also in the pandemic, and in the midst of a major movement questioning our nation on our sincerity to diversity and equality of all human beings. So we'll have many things to talk about today, but please be careful. Wash your hands all the time. Don't get out if you don't have to. Question yourself, do I really need to get out? Maintain physical distance and have masks. 50,000 people yesterday have become sick because of the pandemic. This has never happened since it started more than 3 months ago. So our curve is not downward, it is upward. So be very careful. And as we are approaching this, I have 3 of my close ones who have left this world because of pandemic. And one of them was Zaman Siddiqui, who is a father who raised a beautiful daughter who is the content manager of Sound Vision because of the pandemic. So please be careful. And follow scientists, not the politician who are saying summer will be okay and there's no need for mask and all that. Listen to scientists. They will help us, not as much as politicians. And the 4th of July is coming in the midst of a major movement across the country. Yes, demonstrations are not as many, but the memory which sits in our heart of Brother Floyd's life taken, in a brutal manner it was taken, is with us. So movement is still on. And I cannot think of anyone to remember at this moment than Frederick Douglass. He was a former slave and a national leader, a writer, and a speaker of the abolitionist movement. He spoke on July 5th, 1852, 12 years before the whole slavery formally was amended in the Constitution and stopped. And he says, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that revealed to him more than any other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. It's a speech which you need to read or watch its performance. It's part of our history. But he ends saying, allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I begin, with hope. Friends, young Black people have exploded in rebellion over the killing of George Floyd. They are toppling statues, refusing to be silent, but silent are historic Black leadership. Not quite, but they're talking in ways which are very different than the street. They are not neither as loud nor as clear. Their response is somewhat muted. And I remember attending a meeting of the NAACP, not a national one, but a regional one. And I sat there listening hour and a half. There was no mention of these streets. There was no mention of anything which grassroots leaders are asking in terms of moving away from policing, moving funding away from prison and from the billionaires and back to the public program. They even didn't talk about police reform. It looked as though that meeting is taking place somewhere, not in the midst of a major moment. So what's happening? Who are providing the leadership? Black churches used to provide the leadership. That's where Dr. King was born, and that voice was heard. He took risk of his life, but he was bold enough and loud enough. Now, streets are bolder and louder. So what is that transition taking place? And to explore that, we have a guest today, Julius Crump. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here, Imam Mujahid.
Julius Crump is an adjunct faculty member at Lake Forest College. He has published articles on cultural studies, Black theology, Richard Rorty and Martin Buber. While earning a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, he co-edited African American Theological Ethics. Well, thank you so much for sparing time for us.
Sure. No, I'm glad to be here. I look forward to this rich dialogue with you.
Okay. Well, I don't know about richness from my side, but I certainly hope you will enrich us. Thank you so much. You know, in past era, Black church and its leadership has led the country, whether it's Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 65, or Fair Housing Act of 1968. But then we see Black Caucus collaborating about that criminal justice reform. We would send more Blacks to prison. A huge system came into being through that. So instead of, and then we see current rise and disconnect. So let's talk first the glorious history of Black church, which contributed in organizing not only churches, but people on the streets, and raising a voice which was not compromising. And of course, our brothers Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali also contributed to those struggles. But share with us the history of the Black church.
It's a great question. There's a few different ways to address it. The Black church, as we typically understand it, is a designation that is given to churches that have served the needs of primarily African American worshipers. And so this starts whenever Richard Allen ends up walking out of St. George's Episcopal Church in the late 1700s, so the late 18th century. He walks out of church because he is attempting to pray in the front of the church, and this is a mixed congregation church, and some of the other parishioners come in and they tell him that you all need to go to the balcony. As African Americans, you all are not permitted to pray in the front of the church. And so in protest, Richard Allen just walks out of the church, and Richard Allen ends up starting what we now know as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so as an institution, this is when the church first starts. There's another figure who's really important here, Absalom Jones. And he's an important figure, but in the history books, the one that's usually mentioned is Richard Allen. And so as an institution, this is when what we now know of as the Black church ends up starting. And so what's important here, Imam, is that it starts as a form of protest. And the protest is against an understanding of Christianity, right, that relegates African Americans, right, to a substandard understanding of who they are, not only socially, right, but in the eyes of God, our Christian God. And so when we think about the Black church, we often refer back to that moment, and we think that almost every important thing that the Black church does as an institution is a form of protest. But that's not necessarily the way in which Black churches function historically. There certainly have been moments of protest throughout the history of the Black church as an institution, but more often than not, Black churches exist and existed certainly in the 1800s and the 1900s as a form of survival. And as you mentioned, before slaves were free, right, there was such a thing as a Black church. So let's just say for about a 50 to 60 year period, all the Black church really could do was gather to worship institutionally in forms that allowed them to promote celebration and promote hope, and hope that a better day was coming. And there's a few ways in which they did this. They interpreted the Hebrew Bible primarily differently than it had been interpreted. So they looked at the book of Exodus and they said, hey, we see God having chosen a people, right, to be led out of slavery and out of bondage. So they focus more on Exodus. But when we look at the Christian scriptures, they focus more on Luke chapter 4. And this is a passage that is attributed to Luke, who's supposed to be a physician. And Luke tells a story about Jesus being concerned about the whole person, right? So not just somebody's soul, but the life they live, right? That's not reducible to their interior self. And so Black churches were really, really keen on survival, elevation to a degree. And so the persons who were in church, oftentimes they would benefit from a lot of the programs that the churches could provide. And we can talk more about those. That's the genesis of the Black church, and just giving a quick sketch of what happens from the Genesis to about 1865 when the 13th Amendment is ratified.
So Black church, you're saying, was mostly a mechanism of survival, which is, of course, is a essential human need.
Sure.
But in some way, it was born in the later period as a form of protest, that I am not willing to sit where you ask me to sit. I need to be part of the whole. Right.
And so they wanted to be included, right? And so although a lot of African Americans could not read, right, at this point, a lot of times they were prevented from reading. Those who could read are reading, right, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures and saying, well, what we're being taught about ourselves, I don't see that reflected in the Bible, right, that I'm reading. And so these overwhelmingly were usually men, right? So men are interpreting the scriptures differently than what's being preached to them by white ministers. Now, that's what you
mentioned the white ministers. So help us understand. There must be, in silent or in secrecy, there will be Black ministers probably who are interpreting those things, although they do not have the formal ordination and formal buildings and all that. Could you dwell a little bit on that aspect?
Yeah, so whenever Richard Allen walks out of St. George's Episcopal Church, he is keen on creating an institution. So before Richard Allen walks out of St. George's Episcopal, African Americans worshiped in secret. So they did worship in secret. And the word that Albert Raboteau uses in slave religion is, right, the invisible institution. And so this is a very, very well-known book, very well-regarded book, and he calls it the invisible institution. And so slaves worshipped in hush arbors. And so one of the things they would do is they would go out into to the forest and they would worship. And the style of worship that they engaged in, as you've probably surmised by looking at a Black church service, was very vibrant, right? It's very embodied, and it's quite frankly different than what was going on, right, on Sunday morning. So a lot of times on Sunday evenings, they would go into the hush arbors, and they would worship God in the way that was in keeping with how they understood themselves, shall we say, as Africans. By this point, many of them had been on American soil for quite a while, but there were certainly residues and carryover from their having been African. And so the ways in which they worshiped in secrecy, as you mentioned, were really, really important. And they were really invigorated and given a sense of hope that what they had to endure, right, from Monday to Saturday could in fact change. And somebody like Frederick Douglass, who you mentioned, he was a catalyst in conveying more so to white abolitionists that how I think about my faith is quite different than how it had been presented to me.
Well, thank you so much. We're talking with Julius Crump, and this is Imam Malik Mujahid. You're watching Muslim Network TV, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Julius Crump. Now, we are here, that history of learning resistance and worshiping and seeing yourself as a whole human being as compared to what is being taught by the white pastors. Now, we're nearly 4 years since a black man was the president of our country. And when he left, now he represents probably the ultimate positioning of the black politicians. Black politicians has been there. So Dr. King cannot be described as a black politician. Of course, he was a church leader. He became conscious of the country and all that. And then there are congresspersons and some senators, and then there is a president. Of course, he was born in Kenya and it doesn't show his birth certificate, and he's a secret Muslim. Leaving that aside, after achieving all of that, now we're back on the streets. So tell me about the black politician as a set of people who are helping. Are they leaders of what is going on at this moment?
Well, black politicians are elected officials, and to be elected, you have to have a consensus based on whatever district you're in. And so in 1965, there were about 200 elected black officials in America. As of 2000, there were around 8,000. And so we see black activism moving from protest to politics. Right? This is not a phrase that I've coined. Bayard Rustin has a well-known essay, in fact, titled that. And so I think one of the questions you're asking is, in the move from protest to politics, really what's been lost, right? So Dr. King is killed April 4th, 1968. Black Power as a movement is waning. Its influence is lessening. In point of fact, Bobby Rush, he was a Black Panther. He's a politician now, right, on the South Side of Chicago. And so what you're talking about, I think, is to what degree have politicians been true to the communities from which they've come, right? And so if it takes a consensus to elect somebody like Bobby Rush, among others, right, there's certainly more than 8,000 of them now. right? To what degree are they speaking for the communities from which they come? And to what degree are they addressing the needs of those who are not elite and privileged, like quite a few of them?
Let me, before you continue with your thoughtful answer, let me add a couple of more elements to this. I mean, you have Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Booker.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way they are talking about the protest, or even President Obama asking people to go vote and register to vote. Where are these people? Do they fully understand what is going on these streets? I mean, whole America is standing up. They're questioning everything. They're questioning history. They're toppling statues. They're demanding a very different thing than police reform, which people have been talking about all their lives.
Sure. So yeah, that's a good caveat. What I would say there, what I would say about that is leadership, African American leaders, a lot of younger African Americans, and quite frankly, younger Americans, they've been disappointed in people who have either been designated leaders or people who have anointed themselves as leaders. I'll try to refrain from mentioning specific names here, but a lot of younger African Americans in particular, they've just been really disappointed. And so with the rise of social media, they've been organizing and galvanizing their fellow teens, right, and young adults in ways that leaders haven't, quite frankly, been able to do. I think some of the reasons why leaders have been essentially not completely ineffective, but they've been mitigated is because how they talk, right, doesn't resonate with somebody who's 18, 19, 20. It's very much the case that in the majority of Americans, eligible American citizens, don't vote, and these numbers are exponentially higher for younger Americans. And so when you're telling a 20-year-old African American male or female from the South Side of Chicago to go vote, that just doesn't really resonate with them. Now they should, right? But across educational lines, class lines, Americans just don't tend to vote, right? And so I think President Obama's 2012 election, I think that was the highest number, and I'm not a social scientist, but I think the number was something like 44% of eligible American adults voted, right? That's 44%. And so if that's all of the eligible American adults that are voting, again, the numbers for young adults is quite lower. So if leaders are telling them just to vote, they're not really going to do it. Now, there have been movements, get out the vote movements. And so hip hop artists have done this. And so it tends to have some effect when a producer like Sean Combs, right? He's done a number of forums trying to get persons to vote. But another hip hop artist, Calvin Brodus, his name is Snoop Dogg, he admitted before Obama got elected, he had never voted, right? And so this is much more the norm. It's not just that African American young adults don't vote. It's that most American young adults don't vote. And so when leaders who don't talk like them, who may not have come from the same context, right, socially and economically, are telling them what to do, and these are supposed to be solutions, the math just doesn't add up. And so some of them are going to riot, some of them are going to loot, but this is the kind of direct action that they think is more likely to lend towards justice. And maybe one other thing here, democracy is just really slow, right? And it's just really slow. And if you don't have anything to eat, you don't want to wait on a bill to be passed that's going to end up being appealed, and it's got to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. This takes a long time. And if you're hungry, you want that need addressed now. And this is where associations, right, religious and otherwise, and community voluntary associations are really, really important for Black communities. So churches provide mosques, right? They provide all kinds of programs and quite frankly, food. I mean, people are hungry, people need money. So this is where these institutions that are endemic and really important to the Black community, this is where they can contribute, because young adults, they don't want to hear from these leaders really anymore. They just really don't. And so this is why I think you don't see a lot of African-American leaders really saying a lot, because the streets are talking. And this is a kind of colloquial way of saying the streets are talking. We don't need you all to talk for us. The streets are really talking now.
So you think there is some thoughtfulness to to giving a space to streets instead of imposing anything on them.
Yeah, no, there's more thought than we realize. But again, when you're living in substandard housing, when the prison industrial complex is a constant threat, your thoughts, right, are going to be not on delaying gratification, right, or what might happen as a result of this bill that was proposed in the House, right? You're thinking about, how can my needs be addressed right now? And this is unfortunate, right? Because kind of getting back to something you mentioned, President Obama was elected in 2008, and the gap between, right, those who have and those who have not did not improve for African Americans. I'm not casting blame or criticizing President Obama, but I think somewhat naively, a lot of African Americans predicted something different would happen, and quite frankly, that did not occur.
Despite the fact he has Attorney General who was also Black, and national security person was a Black, and so the system versus individuals, and from organizers to becoming a politician, I think that's a huge difference as well. Tell me, you mentioned something about that continued role of Black churches. When you need support, they're there. In terms of you need food, they're there. So overall, the trend of church attendance in the country is going down. What is the, do you know anything about, is the attendance of the Black churches going up and down?
Yeah, so it's going down as well. Not quite as steep of a decline, but the numbers were, again, I'm not a social scientist, so I don't look at this and study it intensely, but it's gone from about, in 2000, just in 2000, it's gone from about 73% among Protestants to about 63%. So that's just in a roughly 20-year span. So that's about a 10% drop. In African American communities, it's about a 5% drop. But there's a kind of another trend, right? There's an uptick in what scholars have called nuns, right? So those who are religiously unaffiliated. And so they may believe in God, right, or some higher power, but they do not want to be affiliated with a specific religious institution. So we need to keep track of both of these trends, right? So while attendance is certainly declining, we see a rise in those who are called nuns. And I was looking at this earlier. There hasn't been as much of an uptick in people who self-identify, right, as atheists. And so I think we need to keep these three facts in the front of our minds and our analysis. And so when it comes to Black churches, one of the things they certainly have been doing is they do prison ministry, right? They have food pantries. They provide a lot of needs that are real and material. And so African American churches and African American religious communities need to continue doing this. And I'm under no suspicion that they won't. I think what the streets have been saying is, right, let me just say this as I would if I were talking to one of my buddies. In the poorest of Black communities, there's a liquor store and a church on every corner, right? If that's true, and I was born and raised in a church, that's true in in communities that are very impoverished and disadvantaged.
Well, I live in 95% Black community, and I can tell you that's true also.
That's true, right? And so activists are saying if this is the kind of community that these particular institutions, these churches gets us, then either you all are ineffective or you all just don't know what you're doing. And so you all need to step aside and let us deal with addressing system structures, right, and engaging in politics. And so whatever you all have or have not been doing, it just doesn't seem to have been benefiting our community in ways that are identifiable outside, right, of this particular building in which we worship.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Julius Crump. And when we come back, I'd like to ask you this question. You know, President Obama was put on his spot about his pastor, Reverend Wright. And that type of voice you hear a little bit from, Reverend Barber at this moment. Sure. But it was the prophetic voice of Dr. King. What is the voice of Black churches nowadays? Do you find people like that who question the very fundamentals to help people understand and translate the voices of the streets for the congregations? You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Amazon Fire and Roku, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Julius Crump. Dr. King in 1967 Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York. He took a substantial risk in that speech. That was a very unique voice, and exactly 1 year from that, he was shot dead, actually on the anniversary. I don't know what people think, or there people have conspiracy theories about it, but it was exactly 1 year after that speech in which he talked about a bigger system and questioning and challenging that. He talks about the three evils. And he also, and I quote, he declared that, I quote, "The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism." Do people in churches have the same voice as Reverend Wright, which caused Obama some pain? The prophetic voice of connecting evil of racism and militarism and poverty together, and building people for a long-term change in which whole society can see its humanity. I mean, some good thing is happening. I mean, people marching, and some of the people who are marching, majority of those are not Blacks. That is probably the first time in the history. So it seems as a people we are improving. But what is the voices, prophetic voices in the churches at this moment?
So there certainly are some. Quite frankly, there are far more now, given the fact that it's somewhat fashionable, right, to be prophetic. But I'm old enough to remember when it was not fashionable to be prophetic in a way like Dr. Jeremiah Wright or even Dr. King. And to think about Dr. King, the largest Black Baptist convention, they did not support him. And so when Dr. King would travel around the country, a lot of Black churches would not allow him to speak in their pulpits. And so the Progressive National Baptist Convention was started as a result of the majority of Black churches not seeing his message as in keeping with how they understood the gospel. And so the prophetic voice in what we're calling the Black church has always been a minority voice. That's not to say that if any given event happens in a local community, a pastor would speak out about it. I mentioned my father. I mean, I've known several pastors, and usually what they speak out about is very local. And so if it's true that politics is local, I think it's certainly the case that pastors who are in communities that need their assistance, they will talk about issues that are relevant to their community. They're far less confident and courageous when speaking about the system as a whole. So there's been quite a bit less of that historically, and so we don't want to. I don't think we want to look at Dr. Jeremiah Wright as a complete aberration. But given the context in which he's in, the South Side of Chicago, dealing with disinvestment, underemployment, he's dealing with a lot of issues. And so given the kind of community that he's in, he feels empowered to talk about these issues. Another thing I want to bring up briefly is there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but the degree to which a minister is educated, right, has a lot to do with what they are willing and, quite frankly, competent to address when it comes to systems. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not letting any ministers off the hook here, but in order to talk about systems, you need to have read things other than the Bible. And so given the value that's placed on the Bible, certain interpretations of it, worship, right, music, performance in Black churches, there's less and sometimes far less emphasis on education. And so I can just speak from my own experience. I'm looked at a bit suspiciously because I'm educated. And so there's a certain kind of litmus test that you have to go through if you've been educated. And so they want to know whether or not, right, you've been contaminated by ideas that are not in keeping with the more or less traditional understanding of the church performing its priestly functions. So I don't like this dichotomy, and I think it's a false dilemma. But what ends up happening is we end up contrasting, right, the prophetic function of a religious organization like the church. We end up contrasting that with the priestly function. And again, locally, this dichotomy really doesn't function that way.
Now, share with us, do you know some of the people who are leaders of the current movement? Who are these people? How they came to organize? I mean, in some cases, stories are somebody who has never done anything like that came out and started telling people, okay, let's do something. So who are these people?
Yeah, so if you're speaking about grassroots organizers who don't self-identify maybe as religious, a lot of them have grown up in Black communities, again, where disinvestment has been rampant. The prison industrial complex has ravaged families. I mean, just think about this. In 2010, I think the average salary of a single white woman, is about 42, not salary, but wealth, is about 42 to 43,000. In 2010, Frederick Herrick did this study. He's at Columbia University. The average wealth of a Black woman is $5, right? So if these are the realities, right? And so Black women go.
Wait a minute. Could you say it again?
Yeah. So white single women, right? Their wealth is about $42,000 to $43,000. Black women, their wealth is $5. So we're not talking about salary, we're talking about their wealth.
Hmm.
Right? And so, and if Black women, and it's true, women in general go to churches more than men. The ratio is about 55 to 60 in historically white Protestant churches. But in African American churches, it's anywhere from 65 to maybe 80% of the churches are women. Then if this is a reality, then the ways in which this particular issue needs to be addressed is going to have to be very pointed, and it's going to have to be very, very intense. And so if women are going, Minister Farrakhan has said this, and Malcolm X before him, if women are going to churches and they're going to church under the guise of male leadership, if this is what male leadership has gotten the Black community, then something again has gone wrong. And so the children, right, of women, the children of women who've been quite frankly raised by mostly women, they are not all that, they don't think church is all that important, right? They may be spiritual, religious, but they don't think churches are that important. And so these are the people that are organizing. And so given the challenges that are faced by them, these are the people who are organizing. So for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2014 after Trayvon Martin is, after Zimmerman is acquitted, or he's not charged. One of them is three of them. One of them ends up creating a hashtag Black Lives Matter. And so they were just kind of fed up with the ways in which Black death is glamorized. And so these are the people who are organizing more often than not.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Julius Crump, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Julius Crump. You mentioned before the break an interesting thing, that the hashtag Black Lives Matter, while talking about leadership at the grassroots. Mm-hmm. So this is a hashtag generation which is leading us. Mm-hmm. So difference, what is the difference? I mean, does anyone care? Because everybody who speaks for Black Lives Matter is connected with that hashtag. They're not necessarily connected by the leadership. True. Of the Black Lives Movement organization. So organization versus movement. Do you have any thoughts on that difference?
Yeah, I do. I said a little bit about how it was created. But Black Lives Matter is very decentralized, and this is by design, essentially because of their distrust of leadership. And so the mantra really is, you need to lead yourself, right? You shouldn't, we need mentors to assist us, but we don't need racial spokespersons who are given the mantra, right, or the task of speaking for the Black community. And still to this day, these racial spokespersons, they tend to be male ministers, right? They tend to be male ministers. And so activists and grassroots organizers just saying, we don't need that and we don't want it. And so we're going to create an organization that's very decentralized. And so if you go to Black Lives Matter's website now, I didn't count exactly how many chapters they have. I think it was 38. But that really doesn't tell the whole story, because, for instance, in Louisville, Kentucky, right, where Breonna Taylor was killed, they have what they call books and breakfast, right? So on the first Saturday of every month, you can come and get free books, right? And you can come and get breakfast. And so this is the chapter of Black Lives Matter in Louisville, Kentucky. And so this is the kind of work that they're doing, right? And so we don't necessarily have to pit or contrast, right, what churches are doing with Black Lives Matter, right? They end up trying to do some of the same, and in fact, doing some of the same work. The reasons why they do it, right, some may be more theological or spiritual, and some may just, in point of fact, be based on, right, needs that have to do with some of the figures that I mentioned, right? Socioeconomic concerns about their class status, their lack of education, and about their, quite frankly, their rage about the injustice of a system that certainly seems to function in ways that disadvantage people of color.
You mentioned class. Tell me how class is playing a role in terms of grassroots organizing versus political leadership of the African American community. I'm not quite sure if Democratic Party is really happy with that, or they're nervous about the whole thing.
Yeah, good question. So you mentioned Reverend William Barber. So he has the Poor People's Campaign, right? And so it's interesting, right? He's a minister, certainly in the tradition of King, but he started, right, with Moral Mondays, right? And so he doesn't see, right, morality as something that's antithetical, right, or in contrast to an issue of class inequality, right? He sees these as joint, and so he talks about, right, a fairly well-known comment that King made, right, that budgets are moral documents, right? And so I'm sure you're familiar with that. And so this is essentially what motivates William Barber. And so at the national level, he has prominence at a national level. This is how this issue is trying to be addressed. But there has been far less of that in the so-called post-civil rights era. There's been far less emphasis on the issue of class differentiation. And the issue has really been more, how can we get more African Americans, right, into the middle class? And so it's interesting that in the post-civil rights era, let's just say the post-civil rights era begins in, let's just say maybe 72 or 73. While you have an expanding number of African Americans, right, who are moving into the middle class, right, the prison industrial complex is really exploding, right? And so you have these two trajectories that don't seem to be, to certain analysis, they don't really make a lot of sense. But this is, in point of fact, how the system seems to be tailored to exacerbate divisions in the Black community. And so a movement like Black Lives Matter, it's as much a class critique as it is an issue about racism. And you're definitely right. If you mention class, right, or inequality, a lot of the professional managerial class elites in the Democratic Party, they get a little nervous. You're certainly right about that. So that certainly is true.
Do you think they will be able to take advantage of the streets, Democratic Party, that is?
Well, given the amount of impact in a really short amount of time, given the amount of impact that organizers have been able to make in a really short amount of time, the Democratic Party is going to have to take notice. At the end of the day, democracy is not only slow, but the version of democracy that America has, you need money to make it work. And so I believe Joe Biden last month, or maybe the prior month, he raised more money than Donald Trump to look at this at a national level. I mean, this is important, right? Another way to look at this is it was a really high profile race in Kentucky. So you had a Democratic primary and they were trying to compete to run against Mitch McConnell, who's the Speaker of the House. And the lady, right, the lady who ended up winning, she had $20 million to Booker's $1 million. Right, so money matters. Whether or not it should, we can talk about that, or the Supreme Court can talk about it. Right, Citizens United. Right, this ruling is potentially catastrophic, and it's really highlighted, right, these class divisions. And so churches are going to have to address these issues in more concerted ways than just food pantries, things of that nature. And this is going to take efforts from ministers to look at how they can contribute to this particular issue, because it seems to me a lot of what's going on has as much to do with what we're calling class as it has to do with race.
Well, thank you so much. You have been a good partner in conversation. I learned a great deal from you. I hope our audience at Muslim Network will benefit and will be better educated as a result. And I hope if some church leaders listen to this, they will be less suspicious of you.
Yes, I'm very much the son of a Black church, but thank you so much for this opportunity. I've learned a lot. I appreciate what you all are doing, and peace be unto you.
Peace and salam. That was Julius Crump, and this is Imam Malik Mujahid. You can always watch us on right here where you're watching, Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and MuslimNetwork.tv. Pretty soon we'll be on Apple TV as well. And thank you for our interns, Sumaya Heather and Zahra Nadeem. Peace. Salam.